Thanks, Shane. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for making the effort to come out on a cold June evening to talk about this issue, which, as Shane said, is really the #1 political issue facing our country at this time. And it's an issue that Labour is going to fight the election on. We believe that this country is in the grip of a housing crisis, and we've got an agenda for reform that we believe will be the most significant overhaul of housing policy that this country has seen since the days of the first Labour government. And I'm going to talk you through our policy agenda now, and I'm going to try to respond to all of the things that you've said, and if I don't address a specific issue that you've raised, then please see me after the meeting and I'll deal with it. So, the National Government has been in office for 9 years, and every year they've been in office, the housing crisis has got worse. They deny that there is even a housing crisis, in spite of all the evidence. Now, I would love to get Nick Smith, the former housing minister, or Amy Adams, the current housing minister, to come to West Auckland and see what people in our community are putting up with. I'll give you one example. In January this year, I got a call from a guy, an 84-year-old called Frederick Shimmons, who was living, renting for $120 a week, just up the road in Henderson, a shed in someone's backyard. There were 8 other tenants renting for similar amounts for similar rent, living in old buses and old caravans, and there were 2 other people sharing the shed that Frederick was living in. There were extension cords all over the place. The weather was coming in. There was makeshift toilet and bathroom facilities. It was a disgrace. Now, there are people living in substandard conditions throughout our community. There was a family living in a tent not very far from here recently in someone's backyard. There are dozens and dozens, hundreds of families living in garages and sleep-outs and squashed into spare rooms. It is a disaster. On top of that, we have a whole generation of young people who, for all intents and purposes, are locked out of the Kiwi dream of home ownership. Now, for generations, people have come to West Auckland to get a start in life. And one of the reasons they came here was because housing was affordable. And people have come from all over New Zealand. In fact, they come from all over the world in the last decade or two. And yet, West Auckland is no longer affordable. The average house price in West Auckland is more than $850,000 now. Is it any wonder that the rate of home ownership in New Zealand is now the lowest it's been since 1951? The average house price in Auckland is $1 million. And The Economist magazine recently rated New Zealand housing relative to people's incomes as the most unaffordable in the world. Now, it's only a generation ago that you could raise a family and pay off a home, own your own home, on one income. And that could be an unskilled job, actually. I met the guy the other day who worked in the freezing works. He and his wife raised 5 kids and owned their own home. And he worked in the freezing works all his working life. We've got ourselves into a terrible mess in this country. A terrible mess. We're a basket case for housing. As a country, somehow we've forgotten to do the most basic thing, and that's provide decent, affordable housing for our people. So I don't want to talk any more about how bad things are, because I think the fact that you're here shows me that you know how bad things are, and you're looking for solutions. So that's what I want to talk about. But the first thing I want to say is that the current government would like you to think that not only that there is no housing crisis, but they would like you to think that the kind of housing challenges, because that's what they call it, the kind of housing challenges that we have are a problem that all successful countries have. They would like you to think that the housing situation is a problem of success. And the theory goes something like this, that New Zealand is so successful at the moment that New Zealanders are coming home from overseas and therefore there aren't enough houses to house them. And that's why we've got this. Well, nothing, folks, could be further from the truth. There are lots of countries that don't have these problems. Germany has had stable house prices for 30 years. I could give you half a dozen cities in the United States who have more people than Auckland does, faster population growth, and houses that are 3 times more affordable. So we've got something badly wrong here. The other thing, and the other reason that I don't want you to be pessimistic or fatalistic about our ability as a country to fix these things, is that our parents' generation fixed these problems. We had the highest rate of home ownership in the world once. We used to have governments that believed helping young first home buyers into their first homes was something that governments did. And in fact, Te Atitude North, a stone's throw from here, the entire community was built, houses for working class families to get a start in life. And the government gave them a cheap mortgage and allowed them to capitalise the family benefit. Generations of New Zealanders through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s got help from the government to get into their own home. Did anybody here get a state advances loan? Yeah. Or maybe your parents did. Did anyone capitalise the family benefit to get a deposit together? Yeah. That's what we used to do. Yep, home ownership savings account. And as a result of those policies, we never had a housing shortage because the government stimulated the building of new housing that kept ahead of the population curve, and it helped generation after generation of families into their first homes. We also had governments, in fact, most of all, the first Labour government in the 30s and 40s, that built tens of thousands of state houses to get rid of the slums, to get rid of the overcrowding, to make sure that families in this country could get a decent start in life with a warm, dry home and a secure roof over their heads. And for years, that was the way in this country that we guaranteed kids would get a decent start in life. And the families wouldn't be living in slums and overcrowded conditions that are now commonplace in our own community. So let me start off by talking about I think everybody understands that house prices, like any other price, are set by supply and demand. If you have not enough supply and too much demand, prices are going to go up. And that's what's happening at the moment. But the national government's in denial about that. They don't even want to know about the demand pressures. They don't want to know about speculators. But the truth is that our city has become a speculator's paradise. It is out of control. And if you've seen the stories almost every weekend in the New Zealand Herald about people buying houses, including in our own community here, and flipping them off, sometimes on the same day, and making hundreds of thousands of dollars profit. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's a sign of a market that is out of control. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to shift the goalposts. We're going to change the tax settings that currently encourage this mania of property speculation. So the first thing we're going to do, and we'll do it within the first few weeks in government, is that we are going to ban foreign buyers from buying existing houses in New Zealand. There is no upside for New Zealanders in our community having people who are not citizens and not residents of our country speculating, buying and selling properties just to make a profit. All it does is drive prices beyond the reach of ordinary people here. And that's exactly what's happening. So we're going to change the law. It's what the Australians do. We're going to say that if you're not a citizen or resident of this country but you want to buy real estate here, build a new one. Build a new one and add to the supply. And in Australia last year, that policy channeled $30 billion of investment into the building of new homes. That would be a pretty good problem to have. The second thing is that we're going to make speculators who sell a rental property within 5 years of buying it, we're going to make them pay income tax on the capital gain. So if you buy a house and you sell it off within 5 years, and let's say you make $500,000, which would not be unusual in the current market, as we've seen, then you'll pay income tax. So you could pay up to 1/3 of that in tax. we think that will slow down the speculative mania that's driving house prices so high. The third thing we're going to do, and Ranjit, this goes to your question, we recently announced we're going to close the tax loophole that currently allows property investors to run a rental property at a loss. It's called negative gearing. Running a property at a loss, so you're paying the bank more in interest payments than you're getting in rent. Currently, investors can do that, but subsidise it by paying less tax. We think that's wrong. You and I go out to work every day to pay our tax, don't we? Whether we like it or not, we go to work to pay our taxes. Why should our taxes be going into the pocket of property investors to subsidise their investment? If their investment can't make $1 in its own right, why should we be subsidising it? That's our view. Now, Ranjit, you asked about mum and dad investors, and it's true that there are plenty of people who believed, particularly after the share market crash in the 80s, that buying a rental property is a way to provide for your retirement. Now, we have no beef with mum and dad investors who want a stable long-term investment for their retirement. But most investors who use these tax rules only use it for a few years while the property's making a loss. And we've said we're going to have a 5-year phase-in period so that gives people 5 years to move their property out of loss-making into profit-making. This policy change will mostly hurt the big speculators who use negative gearing on a large scale. Most of the benefits, the tax write-offs from negative gearing, are being pocketed by people who have more than 5 rental properties. Those are the people that we're going after. The next thing we're going to do is that Andrew Little announced this today, and you may have seen it on the news, we are going to cut back immigration by 20 to 30,000 per year on the current numbers. National has allowed immigration to spiral out of control. They've been running an open-door immigration policy that has put enormous stress on our biggest city because they haven't invested in the infrastructure, the roads, the schools, and it's been creating huge demand, excess demand in the housing market that's been driving prices up. So we think it's time to give Auckland a breather while the infrastructure catches up, including housing, including the transport system. So those things we believe will all make a significant difference, and in our first term in government, we're going to initiate a comprehensive review of the whole tax system. And we'll look at capital gains tax, we'll look at a land tax, there's a whole lot of things that can be looked at, but we want to do it in a systematic way. While we're in government, we've got access to all the resources of the public service to look at how we create a fairer and more balanced tax system. And we want to encourage businesses that grow jobs and exports and make the country wealthier, not real estate speculation, because we'll never ever get wealthy as a country just selling houses to each other. All that does is make some people rich and others poor. All right, so that's the demand side. The other part of the equation that we have to look at is supply. We're not building enough houses in this country. And over the last 6 years, a shortfall in Auckland has built up of 40,000 houses. We're 40,000 houses short. Now, the upshot of that is that there's a lot of overcrowding. A lot. Families, multiple families squashed into a single home. And people living in the kind of substandard sleep-outs, garages, people living in campgrounds. That's the upshot of the shortage of housing. And it's actually getting worse at the moment. Auckland needs about 13,000 to 15,000 houses every year just to stand still. But last year, Auckland Council tells us only 7,000 new homes were built in Auckland. So we're falling behind by about 7,000 a year at the moment. That shortage is one of the key things that's driving house prices up. So Labor's got big plans to deal with this. We're going to, first is our Kiwi Build policy. We're going to build 100,000 affordable homes over 10 years and sell them to first home buyers. Thank you. So this policy is inspired by the state advances loans that I talked about. Decade after decade, when successive governments, Labor and National, supported young families, Kiwi families, into their first homes. That's what we're going to do. By building the homes, we sell them to first home buyers, then reinvest the money, and we spend that money about 20 times over 10 years. We're going to borrow $2 billion, by the way. $2 billion we're going to borrow on your behalf and invest in building houses. Build, sell, build, sell, build, sell. Over 10 years, we will have built 100,000 homes, and the taxpayer will come out even. It's fiscally neutral. So when we do that, we will have added to the supply, so we will have fixed the shortage of homes, and we will have housed a whole generation of young families who are now locked out. Now, you're probably wondering, what kind of houses will these be? Well, they'll be designed and built by the finest private sector architects and construction firms. They will be modest homes. They won't be a 200 square metre home with 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, but they will be perfectly good, well-designed, modest Kiwi homes that families will be proud to live in. Now, I live in Te Awamutu Peninsula. I'm surrounded by homes in that suburb, good, modest homes that were built for working families in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of those homes are now selling for $1 million because they were so well built. So, Tony, we are going to use off-site manufacturing. We're going to tender the work, thousands of houses every year, tendered to companies that can scale up and build fine quality homes and factories that will be able to do it cheaper and better quality than might otherwise be the case. We're going to create 5,000 new jobs in the construction industry. And we are going to invest heavily in apprenticeships and training so that young Kiwis, some of those 90,000 young New Zealanders who are not in training or education or employment, we're going to train them up and give them the most amazing opportunities and career pathways, because we have a lot of things to build in this country over the next 30 years. Do you have a question?
I was curious, have you got ideas about where those 100,000 houses will be built?
Yes, thank you for asking that. So where are we going to build these houses?
Are they going to be like prison cells?
They will not be like prison cells. Actually, the national government's affordable housing policy is to spend $1 billion on a new prison. We don't think that's a very good housing policy. We're going to build actual houses for people, and we're going to try and build fewer prisons, actually.
How far out of Auckland?
So we're going to build these houses both in the city and outside. We're going to go up and we're going to go out. You think about our community here in West Auckland, Henderson is ripe for redevelopment. It's desperately in need of more investment. It's got space. It's got fantastic transport infrastructure. What I want to do, and I know Shane Henderson from the local board feels the same way, we want to redevelop the Henderson Town Centre and build high quality housing. All kinds of different townhouses, terraces, apartments, flats, with beautiful parks, access to retail and civic amenities, and easy access to a train station, which will have trains running every 5 minutes in peak hour once the City Rail Link gets built. So how's that for a vision for Henderson? So we can do that. So we're going to do large-scale developments that are master planned. So think of, you all know Hobsonville, right? Think about the scale of Hobsonville, 5,000 new dwellings. Now that was easy because it was done on the old airbase, open space, green fields. But we're going to do developments on that scale in the city, and particularly around the rail network where you've got access to high quality rapid transit. We're also going to, if a developer is building, let's say, 500 units or townhouses somewhere, they might come to us and say, I reckon about, a third of these places could be Kiwi-built affordable homes. And we'll say, all right, we'll buy them off the plan up front. And that will guarantee a certain percentage of affordable homes. In Auckland,
are you going to be demolishing state houses in order to do this?
Gail, some of those we will, because the state houses that are on, much of the state housing around Auckland is desperately in need of renewal. We need better, warm, dry homes, and we need to use that land more efficiently. Where Labour's different to National in this regard is that we will guarantee that if tenants are asked to move out of a home to make way for a development, they will have an absolute right to return to those neighbourhoods and those communities.
They only need insulating, and they you don't throw away a $200,000 home that needs a little bit of maintenance and insulating to put up a new home that's not as good as what you started with.
I'll tell you the other
I've
difference
got
between...
30 plus years architectural experience.
Gail, I'll tell you the other difference between Labor and National on this. You're right that the way National has approached the big redevelopment projects has largely been basically a kind of, it's gentrification on steroids. That's what it is. And we're not interested in doing that. We want to build great communities for people to live in with more state housing, because we need more state housing, more affordable housing, as well as some open market housing. Now, the affordable housing... Gail, hang on, this is not your meeting.
No, no, it's not.
Gail, just let me answer, this is not your meeting, so please give me a chance to speak. So, National recently announced that they were going to build 34,000 houses. To do that, they're going to demolish 8,000 state houses, so that means 26,000 new houses. Of that 26,000 new houses over 10 years, only 4,000 will be affordable, according to National's promises. Now, I told you before, we have a shortfall of 40,000 houses in Auckland already, 40,000. Of the houses that are being built by the market at the moment, only 5% of them are affordable. No one's building affordable houses. The developers are choosing to build expensive million-dollar houses. Why? Because they make more money. And that's why Labor and government will step in. We will build affordable houses because that's what people need. Now, the other thing about... Yeah, question at the back. Yeah, so let me tell you what... the real definition of affordability is 30% of your household income. You should not be paying more than 30% of your household income. If the housing market and system was working properly, that's the benchmark. You should not be doing that. But there are lots and lots of people in New Zealand who are paying 40, 50, 60, even 70% of their income on housing costs. That's owner-occupiers and renters. That's how badly out of whack things are. With our Kiwi-built homes in Auckland, we know that we can build and sell on at cost to first home buyers medium density homes for between 400 and 500,000. And we're going to have to work really hard to do that. We're going to have to build at volume to drive down costs, to take advantage of driving down the cost of building supplies. The government is going to have to be the developer, so we forego the developer's profit margin to drive down the land costs. But we can do that. So you're looking at a townhouse between 400,000 and 500,000, a standalone home likely further out on the edge of town between 500,000 and 600,000. But we are going to do that, and we will bring down the cost of housing. There are some other things that we're going to do to encourage more supply. So I talked about Henderson as a redevelopment option. We're going to set up urban development authorities that will cut through the red tape to build whole new communities with good infrastructure, good access to civic amenities, parks, beautiful urban design, and good architecture. And we're going to do that not just in Henderson, but in 10, 12, 15 places around Auckland.
Question down the back end, Phil.
Sure.
If you said a 30% affordability, how would that help on the side curves with maybe 4 or 5 more children?
So it's going to be very hard in the first few years to build homes in Auckland where land is so expensive that will be affordable for people on low incomes. I'm going to be totally upfront with you. It's not, in the first few years, it's going to be very hard to do that. And so we've got some other policies that will deliver better quality, more affordable housing, including rental housing, for people who can't afford to buy. So, if you just give me a moment, bear with me, and I'll run through some of those other policies. The other thing we're going to do to encourage more housing to be built is that people often say, the land is so expensive. Where are you going to get the land from? The fact is that we don't have a land shortage in New Zealand. In fact, less than 1% of land in this country is urbanised. What we have is a highly restrictive planning system that chokes off the available supply of land for development. And that's what drives land prices up. We've had a planning system that has stopped our city from growing up, and it's stopped it from growing out. And that has just created a pressure cooker that's given us some of the most expensive urban land in the world relative to our incomes. And when land is expensive, developers won't build affordable homes on it because it doesn't make any sense commercially. And when the land is so expensive, it encourages speculation and land banking. So, you know, if you look around the green land all around the edge of West Auckland and down in the south and the north, that land is all owned by land bankers who have bought up those plots of land and are sitting on them, waiting for the zoning to change, and they will make massive windfall gains. Millions and millions and millions of dollars will go into the pockets of those land bankers. And who pays that? The home buyers. They will be. What was that? Yeah, there are a number of things that we can do. So one of the things is we're going to bring in rating systems that will allow us to tax the land bankers. When land is zoned for development, the rates will go up, and they either develop it and turn it into houses or they don't. But we also want to tax them as well as using the rates. So we're going to free up the planning system. We're going to allow the city to grow up. So around rail stations like Henderson, New Lynn, other parts of the rail network, we're going to encourage more density and more height. There are plenty of people who love to live in a good, affordable apartment. Not everybody wants to spend their weekend mowing the lawn or doing the gardening. And we're going to allow the city to grow out as long as we can also protect the environment and protect the shape of the city. And we will invest much more in transport infrastructure to support the development. You know why the Northwestern Motorway is such a disaster these days? Because there's massive development going in the Northwest, and everybody is reliant on the Northwestern Motorway. It can't cope with the traffic at peak hour, and as a result of that, it spills back into our neighbourhoods and suburbs, into Lincoln Road, Geography Road, Royal Road. That's the problem. That's why we have this gridlock that blights our community. So we have to invest. So Labor is going to invest as a priority as soon as we're elected. We're going to build a rapid transit busway right beside State Highway 16. In fact, we might even just make it light rail, go straight to light rail instead of the intermediate bus rail. Thank you. It's utterly irresponsible to build and grow and develop communities without putting in the transport infrastructure to support that growth. And that's what we'll do. What was the question?
Several questions here. Go Paul first.
Well, one of the biggest issues I think concerning the housing is the actual cost of material. How's the Labor Party going to address that issue regarding raw materials?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So, some of you will know this, that in New Zealand we pay about 30% more for building materials than Australians pay for the same materials. It's not the major reason that our housing is so expensive, but it is still a significant reason.
They've got a monopoly.
Yeah.
Yep, like there's a duopoly really. Carter Holt Harvey are the other one. Between them, they've got the market stitched up, and they use all kinds of rorts and rebates to keep competitors out. So with our Kiwi Build policy, we were tendering work for like 10,000 new homes a year. We're going to do bulk deals that will cut through those rorts. I also want to see us give more powers to the Commerce Commission. I asked the Commerce Commission to investigate the wallboard market. You know, Jibboard, Winstone Wallboard, owned by Fletchers. They drove out Knopf, the second biggest supplier of wallboard in the world, couldn't get into the New Zealand market because of these rules. So the Commerce Commission looked at it and said, we don't have the powers, our legislation doesn't allow us to do it. I want to give them more powers so they can do that. So those
They
are
pay
two.
the competitors to keep their prices high, because I know with Elephant Board,
Sure.
they do that.
Yep, you're quite right, Gavin. So the other thing we could do is we could set up a buyers cooperative in the building supplies market to keep the buses honest. That's the other thing.
Question down the back here.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Janet Robin. I'd like to ask you, why is the Labor Party not focusing on maintaining and building state housing as its priority? And what percentage of these houses that you're planning to build will be state houses? And why would you sell off state houses for private investors to make so-called affordable homes, which will not be affordable for low income or even, I would say, medium income people? They will be for medium to high income people who can afford even $400,000. So The traditional voter base of Labour, which is the working class, will not benefit at all from the policies from what I'm hearing.
So thank you, Janet, for that question. But it's only 8:05, and I'm only halfway through my list of policies. So I'll now talk about Labour's plan for state housing. We believe that state housing is a really important part of our heritage as a country. It's how we've ensured that people who struggle in the private rental market can get a decent roof over their heads. It's an absolutely vital part of who we are as a nation. National has set out to privatise state housing. They want to sell it off. First they wanted the Salvation Army to buy these houses, and the Sallies said no. Then they wanted the iwi to buy them. Iwi said no, we don't want them. Now they're trying to hock them off in Australia to Australian companies. National has reduced the number of state houses in New Zealand in the last 8.5 years by 2,500. While the population has got bigger and bigger every year, and poverty and inequality has increased under their policies, they've actually reduced the number of state houses. National has taken out of Housing New Zealand $1.8 billion in dividends, that is profits, taxes and interest payments. They've taken that $1.8 billion and Bill English has put it in his back pocket. It's gone straight into the coffers of the government. Now what they should have done in the middle of a housing crisis is what? Build more houses. How hard is that to understand? Do you know how many state houses, what is the percentage of state houses in New Zealand? Somebody have a guess. What percentage of houses are state houses? 4%. It's 4%. It's incredibly low by international standards. Most really poor people in New Zealand don't live in a state house. They pay more rent with less security of tenure in a private rental that in general will be worse condition than the equivalent state house. It's one of the reasons why in this country we hospitalise every year 42,000 children with respiratory and infectious diseases. You'd think we're a third world country. It absolutely is a disgrace. And West Auckland is full of these places. Private rentals that are cold and damp. And it's not just the kids. We have a thing in New Zealand called excess winter mortality. What that means is that that's public health speak for the fact that 1,600 mostly older New Zealanders die premature deaths every winter. And it's largely because of cold, damp homes and the fact that they can't afford to heat their homes properly. Do you know how many people die in winter from cold, damp homes in Scandinavia, and Norway, and Denmark? None. I was talking to Innes Asher, Professor Innes Asher at the Auckland Medical School the other day, and we were talking about this issue. And she told a story about how she'd asked a doctor in Sweden how many kids are hospitalised every year in Sweden, which is a very cold country, by the way. And he looked at her as if she was crazy and said, I don't think we've had one for a long, long time. And then she said, oh no, there was one house that some people were living in, a building that some people were living in that was cold and damp. But then the government knocked it down and built a nice warm, dry one instead. So, this is, I've strayed a little bit into warm, dry homes, but let me finish just talking about that. We are going to set tough minimum standards to make sure that all rental properties are warm and dry. We're going to change the Residential Tenancies Act so it will be illegal for a landlord to rent out a home that is cold or damp, because we're going to set standards. Rental properties will have to be properly insulated, they will have to be properly ventilated, and they will have to have a fixed, modern, affordable heating source like a modern heat pump.
What else are you going to do to the Tenancy Act?
I'll come and talk about that, but let me go back to state housing, because this is a part of our reform agenda that I think is incredibly important. As I said to you, National's been using Housing New Zealand as a cash cow. They've sold down the number of state houses. If they'd used that $1.8 billion that they took out of Housing New Zealand, they could have built 5,000 extra state houses with that money. If they'd done that, we wouldn't have the mass homelessness that we currently see. So what is Labor going to do? First is that we're going to run Housing New Zealand as a public service with one job, and that is to put a roof over the heads of Kiwis who need it. We will not run it as a corporation and milk it for profits. We're going to bring it into the public service. Any surpluses that are generated will be used to build more houses and fix up the ones that we've got. We are going to stop the State House sell-off that National's coming to. National's currently trying to sell 2,500 state houses in Christchurch, and they've had Treasury officials in Sydney pitching those houses to Australian companies. Now, we will pull the plug on that. If that deal hasn't been signed and sealed by the time we're elected, we will pull the plug on it as soon as we are elected. We just put a
But I
stop
have
to
to
it.
say about the selling of state houses, my daughter lives in Hastings, and there's a place, the name of it, where there's a whole lot of state houses.
Flaxmead.
Flaxmead, and it's a grotto.
Yep.
It's an absolute grotto. And nobody of decency wants to live there. There's all these empty houses. And it's like in Huntley. My son bought 2 houses a couple of years ago for $80,000 each.
Yep.
He rents them out. He's bought them as a long-term investment for his old age. But nobody wants to live there either, because all the gangs and all these man-eating dogs are roaming the street. They're state houses that if they cleaned out the people that are in them, we could have houses for people, and it's not far away from Auckland.
Sure.
Where do those people need to live?
So, hang on. The fact that Housing New Zealand has been run down, the fact that for years they didn't maintain their houses properly, the fact that they've allowed some of those neighbourhoods to go to hell, in my view, that is not a justification for selling off the housing stock.
Nobody wants to live in them.
It's an argument for redeveloping those communities and building good, warm, dry homes in well-run and well-designed communities, because people need those houses. So we are committed to modernising state housing. Instead of reducing the number of state houses, we have promised already that we will increase the stock of state housing net by at least 1,000 a year until demand is met. And Andrew Lisbon has said we will in fact be much more ambitious than that. We need more state housing, not less. So we are, Janet and Gail, we are going to redevelop some Housing New Zealand land. We are going to replace those houses with better warm, dry homes and a better mix of different types of housing. But we are absolutely committed to substantially increasing the number of state houses.
So you said 1,000 per year is what you're promising. But didn't you just say you were going to build 100,000 private homes? I mean, that shows that, priorities. I think you've got your priorities wrong.
Sure.
Why don't you build 100,000 state houses and 1,000 private houses?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. So one is that to build 1,000 extra state houses costs about $350 million. So it's a lot of money to do that. When we're building private houses for sale, that money just gets recycled, and in 10 years it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. So it's partly a question of the available capital that we have. But bear in mind that Housing New Zealand has a balance sheet that's now worth $22 billion. So we do have the capability to do a substantial build, and I hope and expect that we will build a lot more than 1,000 a year net. So we can and we will do more. We're building houses for home ownership because we think that's what the huge majority of New Zealanders want and aspire to. And I point you again to communities right here in West Auckland, where fantastic communities were built, great affordable homes for working class families were built, whole new communities. We've done it before and we're going to do it again. Hang on, Janet, we can carry on afterwards, but I want to keep moving on.
Sorry guys, we'll just interrupt. So no more questions for now.
Janet, we'll come back to you, Janet.
What's the annual income someone needs to...
Janet, we'll come back to you.
What their expenditure...
I appreciate your question, but we'll come
What
back
is
to
the
you.
income? What you're talking about?
Promise we'll come back and we'll have questions.
Yeah, so I want to talk about...
What's your... What... Do you say...
Sorry, excuse me.
What income does
Excuse me.
support that?
Janet, if you can't show good manners in this meeting, I'm going to ask you to leave.
I think that's a reasonable question. Why can't you answer?
I've asked 4 questions of yours now. If you can't show some good manners to the other people in the room, I'm going to ask you to leave the meeting.
I think everybody else here wants to hear the answer.
I think you're discussing the way you
part of the agenda I wanted to cover is renting. More than half of New Zealanders now rent. It used to be something that was something that people did when they were young, before they got to own a home of their own. It's now become the reality for most New Zealanders. And yet, our rules and our laws for renting are archaic in this country. We're an outlier. New Zealand provides fewer rights for renters than almost any other country in the Western world. So, if you're a renter, you'll know this. But you can be booted out by the landlord in 90 days. The landlord doesn't have to give a reason.
Yep.
For 42 days, you can be booted out. For 6 weeks, if the landlord can meet one of a few reasons that are set out in the Act. You don't have the right to own a pet. You don't have the right to paint a wall a different colour or put up a shelf. You don't have the most basic and simple of rights. When you're renting, if anyone's rented recently, you'll know how tough it is in this market. The letting agency can charge letting fees, which can be up to 2 weeks extra rent on top of the rent in advance and the bonds that you have to find. So it's a very tough world out there for renters, and I don't think, and Labor doesn't think, that it's okay for half of our population, families. How can you raise a family with that kind of insecurity? So we've got to modernise these laws and make it, and drag New Zealand into the 21st century. So this is what we're going to do. I mentioned first, we're going to set standards to make sure rental properties are warm and dry. That's the first thing. The second, and I'm giving you a bit of a sneak preview here because we haven't formally announced our policy yet, but I expect that policy is going to extend more security of tenure to renters. What I'd like to do is get rid of the 90-day termination without reason, so that landlords have to provide just cause. There are a number of things that we can do. We can learn from many countries overseas that provide, for instance, tenants with the right of renewal when a tenancy turns over. We can make the standard term for a tenancy longer than the current year. We can make it 2 or 3 years. Lots of landlords actually would like to have long-term tenants, but we have this culture of insecurity. The average tenancy is 11 months. Can you believe that? And who was it telling us about transients and the effect on, it was Judy who was telling us about, in this electorate up in Ranui, there's a couple of primary schools there, and 40 to 50% of their roll turns over every year. 40 to 50%. And how can those kids get a decent start in life when they're moving from one school to another? Because their parents can't find anywhere affordable to live. That's having a terrible impact on the life chances of young kids in our community. So, more security of tenure. I think we should be giving tenants the right to make a house a home. Let people have the right to have a pet or paint a wall a different colour, as long as you return that property to the state of residence upon the tenancy. That's what they do in June and a bunch of other places. And finally, on renting, I want us to get rid of letting fees because there's no justification for them. It's simply landlords exploiting their position on the market to get more money out of tenants at a time when tenants can lease the floor. Shane, is there a question?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Phil. GBR 490, you're blocking people and need to move their car. GBR 490? What is it? Oh, silver. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Phil.
Cool. I wanted to talk about something that a couple of people in the audience raised, and that's housing for older people. This is something that I think is an issue that is not being talked about much by politicians or in the media, but actually out in the community, a lot of people are talking about it. There's a couple of aspects to it. One is that for people who are living in retirement and living often in the family home, maybe a 3-bedroom home with a quarter acre or an eighth of an acre of ground, they want to trade down to something that's not so much work to look after, but there's nothing around for them to trade down to, because the builders and developers are building these big $1 million homes, and I think we've got to do better. So under Labor, when we're doing big urban redevelopments, we'll be building a lot of 1 or 2 bedroom homes for people that are safe and secure, that are warm and dry, that are well designed, that have good mobility access for people who might need it in their later years, that are close to public transport, close to the shops, and part of a community. And I think that will make a big difference. We're also working out how we can work with councils to build 21st century pensioner housing. Because, Judy, you raised the point about people who are entering retirement but they don't own their own home. This is a massive problem in our community because superannuation was designed for people who own their own homes. If there's anyone here who's living on superannuation with no other income and you're renting privately, you'll know how tough it is. It's incredibly hard. The average rent in Auckland's gone up $7,000 in the last 7 years. Where are people finding that kind of money? It's not loose change that you leave lying around. So we're going to work with councils to provide concessionary finance, basically cheap long-term mortgage finance, so councils can build beautifully designed and built 1 and 2 bedroom homes, terraces and townhouses and flats for people who will have affordable rent and secure tenure so they can never be kicked out. Would you like to sound of that?
Yeah.
Gay, you talked about licence to occupy robbing families of wealth, and where are you? Yeah. So you're quite right. The retirement village model is incredibly successful for the shareholders of those companies. And it's taking large amounts of money out of the pockets of people at the end of their lives. And not only taking wealth that's been accumulated over the years that can then no longer be passed on to families, but it's a model that really only works for about 10 or 15% of the population. So that's why we're going to work on not a non-profit public service model of secure, high-quality housing for all people. Let me just see whether there's anything that I've missed.
Are they going to have income-related rent subsidies for those pensioner housing?
We're not sure if we're talking to councils about whether they do that, and in fact, income-related rent subsidies is the subsidies that government pays to Housing New Zealand.
No,
It's a difference between a market rent and a social rent.
Any social housing provider except for councils.
There's hardly any of the social housing providers.
Yeah,
It's mostly Housing New
The
Zealand.
councils have been excluded.
We're not sure that we're in favour actually of extending that subsidy to councils. We think it would be a good thing to do. We argued for it in Parliament and the government decided not to do it. But when we're talking about the housing for older people, we're not sure they will need the subsidy to make it work. Capital grants and loans to build the houses may be enough for them to.
That was why the council said that they were selling their pensioner housing because they couldn't get the IRR.
Sure, but the councils now are saying that if we give them access to cheap long-term mortgage finance, which is actually how most pensioner flats were built in the 50s and 60s anyway, that may be enough. I think we pretty much covered the tiny house building, Amanda. Yes. So because the crisis has made life so difficult for people, it's actually stimulated a lot of creative thinking about ways to provide people with decent housing. And has everyone seen the tiny house movement?
Yeah.
It's doing some really interesting stuff. I think we've got to encourage that kind of innovation. It's not for everybody, but I think there are ways that we can do it. There are other kind of innovative models. If people know Earth Song in Ranui, familiar with that? It's fantastic. It's kind of communal living or collective living for people where they have their own homes, but they have some shared kind of areas as well. So co-housing like that. There's also a place called Abbeyfield, which is sort of large-scale flatting for older people. There's all kinds of innovation that I think we should be encouraging and fostering like that.
Paul?
I noticed the fact in South Auckland, Alan Johnson, that this recognising that there are demographics of the population, like extended families, having a house for grandparents who live with the families under separate quarters. Is that you consider?
Yeah, I think that one of the things we want to do with KiwiBuild is look how it can be made, it can be tailored to work really well for different parts of the community, and Māori and Pacifica families are often really interested in intergenerational living. And so you don't just have a 3-bedroom home designed around a nuclear family, but there might be different living and spaces that are joined. in a way that could work for a kind of an extended whānau concept. So that's something that we're really keen to look at. Valeria, I don't know whether she's still here, but she raised the question of discrimination against tenants. One of the things that we're seeing in this rental market is the inevitable discrimination by some landlords. And I don't want to tar all landlords with the same brush, but there's no question that in a market that's this tight and this difficult for renters, they find themselves discriminated against. Sometimes, Valeria, I'm answering your question about discrimination against beneficiaries, against renters with children, against renters with pets.
And also,
Yep.
one time in Washington, I heard the issue with one of the board of Washington told me, did they ever thought to come back like
Yeah. So it's against the law to do that, right? The law says that landlords cannot do that. Landlords shouldn't even be asking for information, for instance, are you on a benefit? But many of the letting agencies are doing that. So we can toughen up the law, but the best thing we can do is to build thousands and thousands of houses, increase the supply of housing, both rental and owner-occupier, so that tenants have more power, more bargaining power. Someone asked about rent control, and I mentioned how much rents have gone up in the last few years, not just in Auckland, but around the country. Now, we're not in favour of rent control, but we are seriously looking at the idea of rent stabilisation that would put some limits on the number of times rent can be raised in a certain period, like per year, or the percentage increase. And so we're giving some thought to that idea at the moment. But the problem with rent control is that it drives investment out of the market, and it creates kind of strange consequences where you've got some houses that are under rent control, others that are not. It discourages investment in maintenance and repair of properties, and we don't think it's a good model. The best thing that we can do to keep rents stable is to massively increase the supply of housing in the market. So, Cliff. Oh, sorry. Cliff, sorry.
I want to talk about affordability, and following up, just coming in here, I didn't even think about it actually, but my involvement with the Labour Party has been a lot longer than I don't think that anybody else in this building here, and not just as a member, I have been very, very heavily involved. What you're saying today is more or less a continuation of what Labour started off way back before the Savage. But when I was not long married, and this was 1950, I bought a house. I won't tell you how much it was, but
you'll make people cry in this room.
It was absolutely shocking at what I paid then. But I will tell you that as time went on, I bought a house in Te Atatu in the middle of to the end of 1950. In Te Atatu, and I didn't realise that until I was here today. It cost £3,999, including the section, but it was a built home, it was 3 bedrooms, brick tile roof and all that. No cars, no fences, no clothesline, and the idea of that was that you bought the house, and as you afforded it, you then the cost, you managed to work the cost off, so you get the price of the house down.
Yep.
I've had quite a discussion with Andrew Little about this as well, and it gets the price down. I'm not suggesting it's able to be done today, but that's what they did then. First we did the total. I had a number of friends at that stage who, in the same situation, they all came out and helped me put my concrete part down. I helped them, that was about the house. So that was affordable housing on that stand.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Cliff. While that person's getting ready to answer their question, one of the things I want to also mention is boarding houses, which someone mentioned earlier. You may have seen some of the news coverage recently of boarding houses. There's a bunch of them in West Auckland here. They're not all bad, but believe me, many of them are. And they are the housing of last resort for some of the most vulnerable people in our community. They are more or less unregulated by council or central government. They are a disgrace. Some of them are flea-infested, rat-infested slums that are unsafe for people to be living in. And I don't know why the national government won't regulate them. We did a select committee inquiry into them. Labor and the other opposition parties called for a warrant of fitness set of minimum standards to make sure that quality is decent. We said that councils should be mandated that they have to go around and inspect them to make sure they comply, and there should be a register so that the operators of these boarding houses would have to apply for a licence before they would be able to run one of these, and that would enable us to weed out the rogues and the slumlords. So that's the other commitment that we make, is that we're going to regulate those boarding houses, and it should apply to campgrounds as well.
My question was similar to the gentleman at the back, was around shared ownership models in terms of an innovative or different way of thinking approach to people, groups of people being able to own houses together, so might not necessarily be able to own it. It may be sort of a family who the parents haven't been able to afford a home, but their children have come of age now and are working, and between groups of families like that they could own homes together, and also young people, the likes of my son gets older, he may not necessarily be able to afford a home by himself, but with two friends and an appropriate contract, I think if there's some consideration given to lending institutions that they can think a little bit more outside the box in terms of the traditional way of lending money.
Yep. No, I think those are really good suggestions, and I think that I talk about co-housing. It's those kind of models that will enable, that will give people a crack at having an ownership stake. Right. One of the things that we want to look at with KiwiBuild, there are going to be a lot of people who said before who won't necessarily be able to afford a $450,000 townhouse, but they would love to own a place of their own. So I don't know if anyone knows the work of the Housing Foundation. They do some great work. In fact, they build a lot of houses in West Auckland, and they run a shared equity model or assisted home ownership. So that let's say it's a $700,000 home, they might leave $200,000 capital in that home, and your mortgage is for the first $500,000 until you start to pay it off and establish yourself, and then you can buy the remaining portion of them. Well, we could do that on a much bigger scale through government. So that's one of the things.
Could government do that where the government still gets to say own the land and the people who get to own the house, so that
I think it could, Gail. I think that's a really good idea, and I think that one of the things that really disturbs me about what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years with so many people locked out of home ownership is that ordinary Kiwis have been denied the opportunity to accumulate capital. For our parents' generation and the grandparents, that's how people saved. They bought a house, they paid it off, and they built an asset over their lifetime, and then that asset sometimes funded their retirement. More often than not, people who started small businesses in this country borrowed against their house. That's how they got started. And yet it's now a whole group of our community who just don't have access to that kind of opportunity. And it's one of the things that's driving the gap between the rich and the poor, and the young and the old, and the millennials and the baby boomers.
the government keeping the land would also stop, if you have an affordable house, it will stop it from its next turnover being into speculative, because it will be controlled by the other partner in the ownership.
Yep, I think it's a really good idea.
Thank you.
Well, I think with a lot of the young ones today, I can remember when I first got married, we couldn't afford allowance. We sat on bed with pillows on. And I see it in my own family. These young ones today, they don't want to go without anything. They've got to have their big TVs and 2 cars. And I say to my grandkids, well, why don't you just, you've got to go without. They don't know what going without is. That is part of the trouble.
I blame the parents. No, look, it's a serious point. It's a serious point, and a day wouldn't go by without me hearing that point of view. And I'm not denying that our generation, our kids' generation, have got a different set of attitudes about the material pleasures and the comforts of the world. But let me say this: in the last 30 years, housing in Auckland has become 3 to 4 times less affordable than it was. When Joe and I bought our first house in 1989, it was 3 times our household income. That was normal back then. 3 times our household income. In Auckland now, the typical house is 10 times the household income of a median or typical household. It's much, much more unaffordable now. And I think that, you see these commentators in the Herald or whatever saying these millennials should eat less, not so much mashed avocado, or have a few less lattes, or get rid of the Sky subscription. Boy, you'd have to have a lot of flat whites to make up the difference in the house prices.
But I think they've sort of given up on owning their house.
They have.
You know,
There's a whole generation of them.
We'll never afford it.
Right, and
As a millennial, that's true.
I think we have to give that generation hope again, because we can fix this. We can fix it. It's not inevitable. It's not a problem of success. It's a problem of failed government policies. And if we're determined, and if you people vote on a change of government in September, we'll get a government that has the political will to make change, to reform, to change the policies so that they benefit first home buyers instead of property speculators.
So I'll try my best to enforce the talking stick because we've got about 7 questions lined up. So I'll go here first.
Oh, kia ora. What about ghost houses? Because the number of empty houses in Auckland is sort of almost roughly equivalent to the number of families in severe housing need. And it's fantastic Labour's going to build 100,000 houses. That's what we need. But what are families going to do this winter? Why can't families move into those houses? What is wrong with our country and our law that we think it's fine for thousands of kids to go to hospital and we're leaving these houses empty? So why can't they be lived in now, this winter?
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. So, everyone know about ghost houses? Yeah. So we looked at the numbers on this, and we looked at the last census data, and there were about 22,000 vacant houses. I'm not counting batches and holiday homes. And then we deducted the ones that we believed were in between tenancies or in the process of being sold. And the number came down to about 15,000 homes that are empty. And we think that they are likely, no one really knows, but they are highly likely to be speculative vacancies. That is, they're owned by people who are simply parking their money and have been cashing in, getting capital gains in recent years of 15, 20, 25%. And Gareth Morgan, the rich guy who's running for Parliament, he owns a lot of their houses. He doesn't bother putting tenants in them because he doesn't want the carpet to get dirty. Go figure. So, this is one of the worst aspects of the housing crisis. People just using housing as an investment asset, no interest in people living in them. So, the question is, could we, in some countries what they've tried to do is tax those vacant houses to discourage people from doing that? Or do we just go in and take them over and let homeless people stay in? So I'm not, to be honest, I see this as being a symptom of the housing crisis. And in the UK, they've tried to put in place the ability for councils to essentially force the owners of those ghost houses to rent them out. I don't think, from what I've read about it, that it's working very well. I think it's pretty complicated to try and do that. If we squeeze the capital gain out of the real estate market, it will end. The only reason people are doing it is because of the massive capital gains, and I think that's a more sustainable solution.
On the same score, Phil, I'm aware of a few.
We'll come to you, Peter.
I'm aware of a lot of
Could you speak up, please?
New houses being built.
New houses being built that haven't been sold, and that I've heard that to give an example, the Swanson area, there's a big development going on. I've heard from sources within there that they're not selling.
Sure.
And